Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and welcome to our second session of the Muslim Vote, Part 2, with a post-election conversation with Abubakr Nanabawa, one of the co-founders and spokesperson for the Muslim Vote. It gives me great pleasure to continue our conversation because this is, of course, something which is only going to become more and more important as we go forward. So, of course, we had our first conversation last week in which we discussed a wide range of issues pertaining to the Muslim vote. But as you know, I had a broader range of questions. In broad contours, the Muslim vote emerged in the last year or so, December 2023, amid widespread discontent over the Labour Party's early support for the Israel war on Gaza, and its quite disgraceful stances at the time, particularly on the part of Keir Starmer, who said that Israel had the right to cut off water, power, and other forms of food, which were in contravention of international law. And unfortunately, we've also seen that the Labour Party, although it gave some initially positive signals regarding its tempering of the Tory stance, as soon as David Lammy, our current Foreign Secretary, visited Israel and got its marching orders, presumably from Washington, very quickly they changed their tune and are no longer, as they initially promised, questioning they're no longer allowing the ICC to continue without putting in an objection in terms of issuing arrest warrants for Benjamin Netanyahu and other top leaders. So that's one dimension of the Muslim vote. It emerged in that context. But of course, the Muslim community is around 4 million strong in these British Isles and has as many concerns as many of the other people in this country. And they are just as concerned about the NHS and the harms in public services over the years of austerity. They're interested in questions of schooling and education. The cost of living crisis, of course, is very high up in our agenda. And of course, for young people in particular, the cost of housing, the impossibly high cost of housing. So all of these things, of course, have driven you, Abubakr Nanabawa, to establish the Muslim vote. Do you want to add anything before I go into this week's line of questioning? Since we last spoke, has anything in particular caught your attention or you want to highlight about the Muslim vote?
I think what's been very interesting, obviously, seeing the reaction from the established Labour politicians. I'm sure you'll go into this a bit more, so I won't say
Absolutely.
too much. But I think it's a very positive sign that for the first time, the Labour Party in particular have had to take Muslim voters seriously, and there's actually a real threat. I remember, watching the documentary of fellow brothers from MPAC, post-Iraq war,
Right.
campaigning really hard just to see Jack Straw get back into power.
Right.
And now, we have a situation where there was a split vote in Blackburn and still the Labour Party lost.
Yeah.
So Alhamdulillah, there's been significant progress made from the Muslim community's end, to be honest, and the education and nuance and the power of that community to mobilize has been significantly increased.
Absolutely. And I think, one of the points that you signaled early on is the establishment, to a certain extent, has been quite upset at the consequences of Muslim mobilization in the political sphere. It's really odd, isn't it, in a sense, because they've always said, oh, Muslims need to integrate more. This is the most integrating act you could do, participate in the democratic process. But suddenly it's not seen as quite so attractive. I wanted to ask you specifically about so let me add a comment first about these attacks against sort of Muslim vote, or the Muslim vote in particular. The attacks have come mainly from Labour, and just to remind ourselves, Labour have something like 60% of the seats in Parliament. So the Tory party, the former sort of like party of government, has been reduced to a rump of its own self. It really doesn't have a great deal of things to say in public these days, and they're kind of regrouping and trying to see what the future holds. So now it's become, the establishment has become the Labour Party, so to speak, or the Labour Party has become the establishment party, and they are the ones, not necessarily the leadership per se, but some of their very important figures have been very directly attacking the Muslim vote. I think Keir Starmer's response to being asked about the Muslim vote and Gaza has been to stonewall and not to address this, and give quite a clear signal that actually these people are not people I'm courting in any way, shape, or form, meaning the Muslims are not people whose interests I am behind. I want to just say that this, to me, suggests a couple of things. One is that there's a certain amount of denial about the significance of the Muslim vote, but the other thing is that anger that is sometimes expressed by some of these people, and I'll ask you specifically about that, if anything's been directed at you specifically, but more at the Muslim vote, is a signal that we're irritating the establishment in, I think, very positive ways from a democratic perspective. We are suddenly important enough that we're being mentioned, albeit negatively, repeatedly in different sorts of settings where we've been criticized. So I think that that's a major win for you and for the Muslim vote as an organization, and also the Muslim vote as an idea, because of course you represent more than, you have your own institution which you're heading, but the idea behind it is bigger than that. And so perhaps you can talk a bit about all of the things I've just commented on, inshallah.
Yeah. I think the biggest power in this election was Muslim voters, as in individuals who really united locally. I think that's the best way to unite. Really, I mean, sure, Alhamdulillah, the Muslim vote has spent a lot of time, effort, going to different communities, talking to people there. But what we've seen very clearly is the more united the community is, the easier chance they have to win. I mean, Dewsbury and Batley, they didn't just beat Labour; they won by what, 12,000 votes, I believe. They doubled Labour's vote share.
Right, right,
I do know that for a fact, right? It
right.
was a huge majority.
Yeah,
The reason being, number one, they had a very solid community-based candidate, extraordinary man, and secondly, because they were exceptionally united as a community. And I think that's the most
mm,
important
mm,
part.
mm,
Right? If you
mm.
unite as a community, you can make any difference you want, and that's due to the people of Dewsbury and Batley, not due to anything the Muslim vote did, not due to any external influences, because they as a community sat down, said we
Right,
need to be
right.
united, we need to have one process, we need to have one candidate.
Yeah.
Right? Initially, there was fears there was going to be a split, potentially even a three-way split. But when the
Mm,
election was called, they got that act together and they
right,
united. Leicester South, I mean, having spent some time there and talked to people there, the level of unity of people in Leicester South was amazing to see. Everyone knew, yeah, I'm voting Shockup. Like, you didn't even need to really
right,
tell them. They like,
right,
I was like,
right,
yeah, election, yeah, I'm voting Shockup. Like,
right,
literally,
right,
he became a mini celebrity on the streets.
right,
The kids were chanting his names,
right,
and all sorts. But this is how you build a an infrastructure. And also, really importantly, I think in other places we've seen is that the Muslim communities have managed to make local community allies,
right,
right, with others. Because, like you said, the disgruntlement of the Muslim community is not only of the Muslim community. I mean,
right,
we only have to look around the world that we're living in, the current economy that we're living in. The UK
right,
still is the sixth biggest economy in the world, not per
right,
capita, but overall.
right,
And you know, we do not have functional public services anymore. Like, if you're ill, who thinks straight away, yeah, let me call the GP? I'm sure no one thinks that anymore, because you have to sit in a queue for like seven. You have to stay on the phone for like 2 hours to get an appointment in 2 weeks' time.
right,
Or if you want to go to A&E, you have to wait 6 hours plus regularly.
right, right,
So these concerns that the Muslim community has locally, if you're able to build relationships with local trade unions, teachers,
yeah,
business people, other faith communities, like the Sikh community,
right, right, right.
Christian communities, white working class communities. There's a really interesting poll
Mm,
um, that showed that in working class communities, so there's five categories of like wealth in this country, I guess. So in the bottom class constituencies, the Labour Party lost 7% of the vote across the
yeah,
country, either
yeah.
to Independents, Greens, or the
Reform.
Reform. Right?
Yeah, yeah,
It shows a very structural, long-term issue for them, because
mm,
they can't
yeah,
continue like this. Because
yeah.
as the country becomes more and more unequal, and that working class base becomes bigger and bigger, the Labour Party will struggle to hold on to a majority if they just do not represent the
I'm
interests of
going
that
to
class
come back and
accurately.
ask you about reform later, by the way, because I think it's something that Muslims need to think about. But sorry to interrupt you. Go ahead. Yeah.
No, no. I mean, we can discuss reform now. I mean,
Sure.
I've had this conversation with a number of people, and I always say, and I always maintain, that
Right.
calling reform voters racist is just
It's,
pointless,
yeah,
uneducated, and just, you
yeah,
know, it. fails to understand the very real concerns that they have. Just because someone's anger manifests in a different way to you does not mean that they are, they're bad. Like, we saw this during Brexit, right? 52% of the UK is not a racist country. I've lived here my
Right,
whole life.
right, right, right.
It's an
Absolutely.
amazing place to live, right? Like
Right, right.
you cannot deny, compared to most of
Yeah,
Europe, compared to the whole of the West, the UK is the best place to be a Muslim. The
sure. I
idea that
mean,
52%
yeah.
of British people are racist is just unfathomable.
But I
Okay,
think
like they might have frustrations,
yeah,
and I think that that frustration comes back to this very simple point, right? Like I said, Muslims have identified the same issue. The
yeah,
Labour and the Conservative Party are not serving the interests of
yeah,
ordinary
yeah,
everyday
yeah,
people. Unfortunately, when these things happen, populism rises.
yeah,
Simple solutions come to the fore. And
yeah,
in the case of the UK, the people who are giving the most simple diagnosis to this problem
yeah, yeah.
are reform. Do I agree with their diagnosis? No. Do I even
Right,
agree with any of their solutions? Absolutely
right,
not.
right,
But
right.
are they providing something different? Are they, providing alternative to establishment politics?
Yeah, definitely,
Absolutely. Nigel
definitely.
Farage might be a man of the establishment, but his politics is not. And I think we have to really understand and come to terms with that. And the only way to tackle kind of
I,
uh, this kind of right wing, populism is to come up with real solutions and tackle and make people's lives better every day, rather than just turning around saying you're a racist, you're a racist.
yeah,
There's no point
yeah.
engaging you, because
I mean,
doing that you'll never achieve anything in life.
if it's all right, I'll just, I mean, like, I'll interject briefly, which is, yes, I don't think it's true that all reform voters are necessarily racist or anything like that. I think we could make a distinction between reform voters and a lot of reform candidates as racist, so to speak, because unfortunately, or some of the activists that we saw on the streets, unfortunately. But again, the point isn't to sort of engage in name calling. That's not good politics. The point, I think, is to recognize that actually a lot of the frustration, the upset, the genuine struggles of trying to make ends meet that so many of us, and so, um, I think it gets even more of a struggle the younger you become. I'm in my 40s now, and uh, if I'm struggling, I kind of wonder, how do people who are getting on the or struggling to get on the housing ladder now coping? They're basically not getting on the housing ladder in the first place, and so I think we do need to engage in that empathy. That's definitely the case. I also think that it's important for us to be clear-eyed about the fact that there are lots of people within the reform establishment, for example, who want to stoke up precisely those sorts of problems and use dog whistles all the time to basically signal at problems. Brexit was another case where people were actually stoking up those sorts of issues, and we need to find an alternative to that sort of politics. I just think that the independents that emerged in and the independents and the Greens, I think, collectively got a similar vote share to the reform, and this represents a massive sort of drop from the establishment parties going to these originally fringe parties. But we need to think about consolidating that in future and making the UK a genuinely competitive electoral environment. But I think the concerns of reform are things that Muslims do need to spend time. People and groups like the Muslim Vote need to think. Okay, well, how do we? Those of us who are very highly concentrated in major cities, in inner cities, very often, whose concerns are very often very different. How do we heal this massive divide between them and the rural, kind of abandoned constituencies where reform has consistently done well? They've had as many as sort of like seats as the Gaza independents, basically, but with a far greater share of the vote because of that frustration. I wonder if you have any thoughts on, like, I don't expect you to necessarily have answers at this point, but we do need to workshop this very seriously. What do we do to um, make things better for people in those sorts of contexts as well? Because most of our interests are very often focused on the inner cities as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, firstly, let me make a caveat to my original statement. I have no issue calling people within the reform leadership
Yeah,
racist or having racist views. No
right.
doubt. I'm talking about everyday, ordinary voters,
Absolutely.
right? Like in my city, like I think reform won about 70% of the vote.
Right.
Um,
Right.
and honestly, I can understand why.
Right.
Look, and I think What's really important is, I think this country, now this is obviously, this is not from the Muslim votes perspective. This is totally from my perspective. This is my
Mm,
own analysis
sure.
of the UK. So I come from a very small city, right? One of these cities where reform did very well, with a with a very small Muslim population and very large working class white population.
Mm,
We have a problem that this entire country's economy is concentrated in two or three zones, right? Predominantly in London, actually. And I think this
mm,
causes an issue for everyone, even people in London,
mm,
because
mm,
what essentially it forces all our best talent when they leave university, they
mm,
have to go to London. Or if
yeah.
they don't go to London,
Mm,
then they end up working in a city with a lower paid job with less career development perspectives. I mean, they're in net they're probably doing better because don't have to pay horrifically high rents.
mm,
But in net, in terms of career progression, they're probably having to take a step back just so that can avoid these rents,
right.
right? So if we can come up with a solution, uh, now, is devolution the solution to this problem? Do we give more powers to metro mayors? Do we give more powers to mayors, etc.? I mean, look, in the West Midlands, a
Yeah.
Conservative mayor was quite popular with the Muslim community
Yeah.
until
Yeah.
October the 7th, right? Andy
Yeah.
Street
Yeah.
was. So I think it's
I,
actually a
I
very
want to come back to
serious
him as well because he's one
question.
of the people who commented incidentally about sectarian politics,
Yes,
and
yes,
so we'll
yes.
come
Yeah, I
back
was
to him.
quite
It's really
surprised. He has
disappointing.
a
Very
historically
disappointing.
good record. Yeah, I was very
Absolutely.
disappointed.
Absolutely.
But I think there is a solution there where we do actually have to, like Brexit was all about taking power back from the EU
Right.
to Westminster.
Right.
I think that was a wrong diagnosis from the start. I think the real
Mm,
diagnosis was we need to take power away from Westminster to local authorities. Our prime minister, I
mm,
cannot think of a country where
mm,
an elected prime minister has more power than in the UK. Keir Starmer could do what he wants for the next 5 years. There is no one to stop him.
mm, mm.
Um, so I think we do need to hand power, and we need to give local authorities spending like ability to spend again. Right, the local councils, their budgets are sucked up by social care,
Right.
um, and they don't have anything left to provide real social services
Yeah.
for young people in their
Yeah.
community.
Yeah. Yeah.
They don't have real power to build social housing in their communities.
Right.
If we do not give powers back to these areas, then we're going to continue seeing a influx of
Right.
people into London, and
Right.
these smaller cities and towns
Yeah.
continue to be neglected because there's a lack of opportunity there.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's really some fascinating, constantly quoted, incidentally, analysis by John Burns Murdoch of the FT, talking about if you remove London from the UK, then the British economy does poorer than the worst state in the United States, namely Mississippi. And I mean, it's basically sort of the UK is, I think one of the ways he put it is, it's a poor country with some very rich people. I mean, this is the tragic irony of a country like the UK at this point in time. It's this dramatic, unequal society that's emerged in the last 20 years or so. I want to sort of switch back to some of these media critiques that have been directed at, whether it's the Muslim vote. I mean, people don't always know that the Muslim vote is an organization. So the way in which people use this phrase in the media often indicates, oh, the Muslim vote as a whole is somehow sinister. And I want to ask you two questions. One is to comment on, John Ashworth, Andy Street, and anyone else who comes to mind in terms of their comments. And the other is to think a bit about the strategy of an organization like Operation Black Vote, established, I think, by Lord Simon Woolley, who was a grassroots community organizer. And they weren't necessarily, they didn't come about because of one major issue, the Gaza war, and so they can't, in a sense, be written off quite so easily. This is a grassroots campaigner who said, look, you're always getting frustrated that the government doesn't listen to you, doesn't care about you. There is a way in a democratic society for that to change. Although, to be honest, to a certain extent, having the financial um, sort of security to be able to go and campaign and canvass and things like that is a luxury for a lot of our communities as well. So that's something I'd love you to comment on. But Operation Black Vote is not, and I don't think has ever been targeted for attack in the way that the Muslim vote has been targeted for attack. And I wonder what we can learn from that from two perspectives. One is there a specific Islamophobia in the establishment that we need to be very wary of, and what can we do about it? And the other is, have we maybe our approach could be adjusted, reflecting on that. So let me throw, it's a whole bunch of questions I'm going to let you address, and I can come back on some of
Yeah.
those.
So let me just address Ashworth and Khalid Mahmoud, who are the two MPs who name
Yes.
checked us. When they talk about us, they call us the Muslim Vote Organization, which is fair. I think that's
Okay,
the
fair
best
enough.
way to
Fair enough.
address the
Yeah.
Muslim vote as an
Yeah.
organization.
Yeah.
Otherwise, Muslim voters in general, like I said, is a lot more localized.
Yeah.
So they both address us as organizations. To me, it just seems that they have become bitter losers. Like with due respect to both of them,
Right.
so Jonathan Ashworth is a different case to Khalid Mahmoud. All right, let's take one at a time.
Sure. Sure.
Jonathan Ashworth is, he's from Manchester. He was parachuted into Leicester for a safe seat.
Hmm.
He's a very, I mean, he's one of the Labour Party's spokespeople. So
Yeah.
he, the Labour Party believes him to be a very capable spokesperson. I
Yeah.
think he's a bit condescending and arrogant from time to time, but I mean that's a matter of opinion.
I'm
And
Bengali, by the
Jonathan
way.
Ashworth, sorry.
So I share that perspective. My parents
Yeah, but
are Bangladesh.
yeah, he has, he's got his talents, he's got his skills,
Yeah.
and but he's not a from some feedback that watching Shocker's interview, it seemed that some people thought he wasn't the greatest constituency MP
Yeah. Yeah.
going. I think that's one of the beauties of first past the post. There's a lot of critiques, but I think one of the beauties is you do actually have a very stable constituency MP who's accountable
Yeah.
to constituents.
Right. Right. Right.
Um,
Interesting.
now there is obviously for him a I think there was just a level of complacency. He did not see it coming at all. He did not
Mm.
for one second believe that a local optician, a
Mm.
grassroots community
Mashallah.
organizer could ever beat
Mashallah.
him.
Yeah.
He spent his time gone on Keir Starmer's tour bus,
Yeah.
doing Sky
Yeah.
interviews. Of
Yeah.
course, he campaigned locally. I'm sure he did, but not to the extent that he could have
Yeah.
and that he
Yeah.
should
Yeah.
have.
Yeah.
And so with him, I think there was a level of arrogance and complacency that cost him his seat, because
Right.
for the first time, Leicester South had an alternative choice,
Yeah.
and they chose alternative over Labour. Very
Mashallah.
clear, right?
Mashallah.
You
Yeah.
provide people with alternative, they will take it. Muslim,
Yeah.
non-Muslim,
Yeah.
everyone wants to see something different,
Right.
and that's how Shocker would have
Right.
won. In
Right.
terms of Khalid Mahmoud, Khalid Mahmoud's
Mm.
a very different case.
Right.
I have a
Right.
lot
Right.
stronger words to say about Khalid Mahmoud.
Sure. Sure.
Um, Khalid
I.
Mahmoud has been probably the chief of all Muslim MPs in ratcheting up Islamophobic rhetoric within Parliament.
I. I tend to
And I
agree
think
with that.
I'm just very proud. You know what? His frustration at the Muslim vote just makes me very happy. I'll be honest. I'm exceptionally happy that he thinks we did all of this.
Right.
And
Yeah.
I'm exceptionally happy that we finally got rid of the man. He has done
Right.
so much harm to the Muslim community,
Right.
and
Right. Right.
now
Right.
the Labour Party are trying to make him an Islamophobia czar.
Oh
I don't
God.
know. I don't
Yes.
like that
Yeah.
word, but it is a reflection of how out of touch the Labour Party is. The Muslim community rejected him not because of
Right.
Gaza. He
Right.
was
Right.
not
Right.
rejected because of his positions on Palestine. Broadly speaking, he's okay on Palestine. He's
Okay.
not. He's not like waving the flag, but
Yeah.
he's been
Yeah.
okay on Palestine in his
Yeah.
20 years
Yeah.
in Parliament. His
Interesting.
biggest
Interesting.
issue is that he provokes Islamophobic narratives. So what
Yeah.
does the Labour
Yeah.
Party do?
Yeah.
Give him the Islamophobia position. It's like
Yeah.
a clear sign they're just not listening to the frustrations of local Muslims, especially his
Yeah.
own constituents who voted him out for
Yeah.
very specific reasons,
Yeah.
because of how divisive he is, and he
I'm,
calls Muslims illiterate.
yeah.
Um, so yeah, it's quite a
Can I
frustration
ask? I
that
mean, I'm.
that's going to happen. But I'm
Yeah.
quite proud that Muslim vote played a role in removing Khalid Mahmoud.
So just asking. I mean, I'm not. As in tune with the politics of various MPs, so to speak. Khalid Mahmoud. So you're, I believe, from the West Midlands. And so, you will be a bit more attuned to the politics of someone like Khalid Mahmoud. I just remember he was constantly sort of this go-to person when the right-wing media needed someone to attack Muslims who was, himself Muslim. He was the go-to person. So whether it's on the Trojan horse affair or a whole host of other issues where the whole of the community or overwhelming majority of the community, albeit, and this is what's crucial, and this is where this election could be a step change for the Muslim community, not the sort of there is a small sliver of the community that has really gotten in with the establishment, and in part they do that by reflecting establishment views, right? And this is how I would evaluate someone like Khalid Mahmoud. He was someone who knew how to, as a Muslim and as a Pakistani, I believe, originally, to say the right sorts of things to the establishment, even if it would be Islamophobic for it to come from a white person, for example, to say the same thing. And that's how he ingratiates himself with the establishment. But of course, I mean, I've been wondering for years, how does this guy maintain his seat in such a large Muslim area? I don't know the politics of the ground. Maybe you can enlighten me on that. But I think it's really just wonderful that people like him have been kicked out. And it's a bit sad that Shabana Mahmood wasn't, kicked out in that same way, because she's another of these, I think, very establishment Muslims who do not reflect the overwhelming sentiment of the Muslim community, but they do reflect the sort of the small sliver of establishment Muslims who know how to play the system and go up the ranks. And so she's in the cabinet now, right? I mean, she's done well for herself. Yeah. I wouldn't say that, but we came so close to unseating her, and that's the sort of thing which I think grassroots.
I would separate Shabana Mahmood from Khalid Mahmood, right?
Right.
Khalid Mahmood is a different breed of.
I'm
Shabana
sure.
Mahmood, there's very genuine critiques of Shabana Mahmood and her policy positions and her lack of understanding of her local community, and maybe a careerist move that she made when she refused to vote for the ceasefire.
Right.
Very genuine critiques, right?
Like,
I absolutely say it, but she is nowhere like I would very much struggle to put her in the same sentence as Khalid Mahmood.
Okay, that's good to know.
Shabana Mahmood does have a level of attachment to the Muslim community that Khalid Mahmood simply does not have.
Right.
Khalid Mahmood, he wants to just vilify Muslims, right? Shabana Mahmood is not like that. Shabana Mahmood, again, I don't agree with a lot of her political stances, but she is not trying to go out and bash Muslims behind closed, or even publicly. She doesn't go out and try to bash Muslims.
I don't know what the legal implications of saying something like Khalid Mahmoud wants to vilify Muslims is. So I don't know if you want to.
In my personal opinion, Khalid Mahmoud has. I mean, we have a post on this. Khalid Mahmoud has continued to have associations with right-wing think tanks.
Yes, policy exchange.
He has policy exchange. He was, one of the people involved within the Trojan horse affair. The extent of his involvement, obviously, I cannot comment. He was also, he's also voted against investigations to the Iraq War. He's quite pro-prevent. He's been someone who's defended Trevor Phillips, right? So I think, from my personal perspective, this is not the Muslim votes perspective. This is my personal perspective. I think Khalid Mahmoud has attempted to vilify Muslims on a number of occasions. Now, that's a personal opinion.
Fair enough.
I think it's an accurate one, personally. Considering his record, so I would genuinely really make a big attempt to separate Khalid Mahmoud and his ilk away from Shabana Mahmoud. Shabana Mahmoud has a very particular understanding of politics, which is very establishment based,
right,
which is very different. I think she is trying to, get the concerns of her constituents and Muslims into the closest corridors to power, and in process, she makes decisions which I fundamentally do not agree with. Whereas Khalid Mahmoud, he's never got anywhere close to power. He's never, but he consistently comes out and vilifies his Muslim constituents.
So just a quick question on these two candidates. So I know Shabana Mahmoud did not voted against the ceasefire motion, or abstained, but
didn't vote. She abstained.
She abstained. Okay. So in line with the Labour whip, which prohibited people to vote for the SNP motion in November, a number of Muslim front benchers resigned on that vote. Some abstained, as Shabana Mahmoud. I think what's her name, Roshana Ali. What was Khalid Mahmoud's position on that?
Khalid Mahmoud voted. Again, he voted for a ceasefire. Khalid Mahmoud's generally been okay on Palestine historically.
So these are things which are, in a sense, the Muslim vote has a responsibility also going forward of keeping the populace informed on these sorts of vote choices. I know you have like this as a table on your website, and that's extremely valuable, because looking for this on the parliamentary website can be quite a challenge for the layperson. So I think that sort of initiative is extremely valuable from you guys. But thank you for, that I think is very useful background. Maybe we can go back a little to John Ashworth and Andy Street. I was quite surprised on the LBC interview there as well. Him suddenly sort of invoking sectarian politics, or a lot of people use that term, sectarian politics, but he said, this is a secular society, and whenever faith comes into politics, this is something which is of great concern, or something along those lines. And yeah, I wonder, like, what's your response to that? And maybe I can reflect on yours as well afterwards.
I think, for years, the Muslim community voted for Labour, right, in bloc, en masse, no questions asked.
Right.
No questions were ever. No one ever said, "Oh, this is sectarian politics." I mean, I really encourage people to look back at the 2005 election where Jack Straw, was it 2005? Yeah, Jack Straw. Watch his documentary with MPAC, right? I don't believe this was sectarian politics, but the Jack Straw used the masajid, right? He did. He used the mosque to his advantage. Do I think that's sectarian politics? No, I think that's using local community institutions to your advantage. Do I agree how the masjids behaved? Absolutely not. Right? I would love to got rid of Jack Straw, but so the idea that the Muslim vote reflecting what the Labour Party, some of the Labour Party strategy for years has been towards the local Muslim communities is quite laughable. Now, we had much less interaction with masajid. We were very careful in how we worked with them. Primarily working on voter drives, etc., with them, and maybe asking them to get us in touch with local community leaders who could, explain the lay of the land to us. But the problem we have here is that the establishment are frustrated, not because the Muslims voted in some areas as a bloc. Again, this is the most dispersed the Muslim vote has ever been across the country, which was part of our aim, actually. We endorsed candidates from across the spectrum. This has not only been the most dispersed the Muslim vote has been nationally, but locally, okay, the Muslim vote has become quite united in key seats. That's brilliant to see. I mean, again, it's a reflection of, to be a Muslim is to share a set of values, whether you're practicing, you're not practicing, whether you're more secular, you grow up in a community, you grow up in and around a masjid, you grow up in and around a set of values, whether it be about, charity, whether it be about community, whether it be about Gaza, whether it be about foreign policy, right? You grow up, and those reflected share of values is what the Muslim vote tries to reflect when they give candidate recommendations. And I think that remains to be true, to be honest.
So, just if I can comment. Sorry, go ahead. I hope I didn't cut you off.
No. I think what's really important to realize is that it's very convenient for, like I say, it's very convenient for the establishment when the few seats that went against them, right? I mean, if you put the Greens, Muslim, the independent candidates and Reform together, there's about 14, 15 seats. 14 seats, right?
Right.
It's a tiny number of seats, but they seem to only concentrate on these 14 seats because these 14 seats pose a question to their continued monopoly of power. It's like calling Reform voters racist, or the way that they talk to Brexit voters before the Brexit referendum. And the sooner the establishment learn that they can't continue to do this, the better it is for them. Because we are not in America. You can't use money to abuse the electoral system. The best thing about UK parliamentary elections, the budget is tiny, very tight. Right. The rules are very strict. The Electoral Commission actually do quite a good job of enforcing them as well. We have taken Wes Streeting, one of the most astute, well-loved Labour politicians within the Labour Party, to within 700 votes. Right, Liane Mohammed, a purely grassroots campain. That's a purely grassroots campaign. Took her within 700 votes. Right, because
she's 23.
They can't.
She's incredible.
She's amazing, and inshallah, one day we will get rid of Wes Streeting as an MP. But you can't keep on ignoring voters because you can't, pump money into elections like they do in America and pump out
Yeah,
misinformation, and
interesting.
you can't use dirty tactics. You really
Yeah,
have to stay within the rules,
yeah, yeah.
and it makes it very possible in a first past the post system in local communities to
Yeah, yeah.
challenge the established parties if we put
Right,
enough time, effort
right, right, right.
into challenging those narratives.
So I think, I mean, one of the things that the Muslim vote could and should do, and perhaps like we can find people who are willing to commission this kind of research, is to, put out periodic short reports that can be read by the average layperson, average voter. I mean, I know Ment has done this in the past as well, but there needs to be a lot of voter education, including like at the local constituency level, to be honest. Thinking about, okay, what do we need to do to empower our vote in a way that, Muslims have been taken for granted by Labour for, I don't know, maybe a couple of generations at this point, but certainly for decades. And I think that would be a really massive service. You're already doing a great deal with your website, but yeah, I mean, this localized focus of information would be very valuable as well. I wanted to just comment a bit about the secular dimension, because secularism is one of the areas of my research. I am an academic who works on Islam, politics, and secularism, and those sorts of questions. And the UK is a really unusual, constitutionally speaking, country, because technically the head of the state is the head of the church. So technically we're a theocracy, right? Of course, I mean, in practice, the norms on which we operate are secular. The church doesn't have, or the king as the head of the church does not, actually have power. He is a figurehead, constitutionally speaking. And number 10 has power, even though we maintain this kind of practice. I sometimes when I teach this at university, including at the University of Oxford, it's really funny. I used to refer to the king as a kind of caliph for in the British Constitution, because the caliph as well is an important figurehead, but doesn't, through much of Islamic history, didn't necessarily have power. It varied a lot, but it wasn't necessarily always empowered. The sultan, as it were, was the government authority in many instances through the late Abbasids, through the Abbasids generally. Anyway, so the point being that it's very strange to talk about a secular political establishment if you've got bishops in the House of Lords, if you have, the Archbishop of Canterbury is, I think, constitutionally kind of second to the king potentially, and appoints the king technically, so appoints the head of state. And so, we do have a lot of trappings of religion in this country, although, as far as I understand, the Church of England has been trying to disestablish. So that's one of these ironies. It doesn't have de facto power, but it does have actually, a lot of power in the House of Lords. And the Archbishop has actually made reasonably positive interventions in the recent past with respect to refugees, for example. At the same time, he's had very malign, I think, comments to make, whether about, in response to the Gaza war, or indeed when Jeremy Corbyn was leader of the Labour Party, all of the religious establishment came out and basically campaigned against him, whether it's the the chief rabbi or the Archbishop of Canterbury. And no one commented at that point, oh, what's happening to our secular politics? We're under threat. And yeah, I mean, I think there's a deep hypocrisy, but it's also a reflection, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on this as well, that Muslims haven't been able to establish themselves as a powerful voice that the establishment need to take into consideration. And this is what these other groups, obviously the Archbishop of Canterbury is a bit of a different story because he's part of the constitution, but Jewish communities in this country, or I mean, other constituencies with special sort of like interests have been working very hard, and this is where we need to work. I think this is where we still reflect, in a sense, the struggles of ethnic minorities. So Operation Black Vote, when it initially was established in the 1990s, considered Muslims part of that sort of like black constituency. But Muslims now have also some distinctiveness, and they've now come of their own. I think this is really an important moment in the history of our electoral politics. I don't know if you want to say anything in addition to that, but
Yeah, I know. To be honest, I just want to comment that Operational Black Bolt was obviously part of the inspiration behind the Muslim vote. Originally, there was some considering calling it Operation Muslim Vote as well.
Mhm.
Some people
Mhm.
were referring to that at the start.
Yeah.
And they've done great work. I think the difference between Operation Black Vote and the Muslim vote is Operation Black Vote stayed completely non-partisan
Yeah.
in a
Yeah.
different way to us. So we're non-partisan in the fact that we will recommend anyone from any party if they
Yeah.
reflect the values and
Yeah.
the values that we wanna our core values.
Right.
Operation Black Vote was purely a kind of voter registration drive, as far as I understand and
Mm-hmm.
remember. They weren't,
And
encouraging
voter
people to
informing. So
X, Y,
informing the
Z
vote.
candidate.
Yeah. Also
Yeah,
informing the sort of like the ethnic minority communities about their rights. So in
yeah,
addition to voter
yeah. It
registration.
was an education. It was an education facility purely,
Yeah.
right? Muslim votes education plus recommendation. I think the plus recommendation is what
Right.
perhaps the establishment was not too happy about,
Right.
because you know, because again, we broadly speaking, apart from when we endorse Liberal Democrats,
Yeah.
endorse candidates who are not part of the establishment.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and I
So
think they weren't too happy with that. And
what
I
are the
think
pros
that
and
that that
cons?
is a reflection of that. Go
What
on.
are the pros and cons of that? In the sense of so Operation Black Vote. I mean, I know that a lot of high-profile MPs and public figures, would join them, publicly and advocate for them, etc. And that's, that does help raise one's profile. And I think, it's they had, Labour and Tories and Lib Dems and everyone involved with Operation Black Vote. What are the pros and cons of like having this neutral position? Obviously, I think the current circumstance where there's literally an ongoing genocide, it's not a time to sort of like just be neutral. And I quote Archbishop Desmond Tutu of South Africa saying, to be neutral in a time of I forget the exact quote, but to be neutral in this sort of in the context of injustice is to stand with the unjust, so to speak, something along those lines. But is this something which in future, if we somehow are able to, and this might take a long time because there's no seeing the end of the current genocide. And I just sort of like, it boggles the mind that we are witnessing a genocide for nearly 300 days at this point on a daily basis on our feeds. And we're witnessing these people with parts of their bodies blown off, children beheaded, etc. And we're still walking through it. And our taxes are being used to fund this right now. That aside, if we get beyond this current genocide, which one day we inevitably will do, what are the pros of potentially taking that neutral stance and saying, look, we want to get all established parties involved and independent voices as well, to try and raise awareness in local communities, to do a kind of constituency by constituency drive informing Muslims of the importance of that vote. Have you thought about this at all? Yeah.
As in not recommending MPs. I think what the Muslim vote's really all about, right? Predominantly, there's one overall core aim, which is we want to educate, unite, coordinate the Muslim vote in order that it becomes a vote locally for the betterment of the UK, right? And I think sometimes people think that, when we oppose Britain's role in the ongoing genocide in Gaza,
Yeah.
not only is it because we are appalled by genocide, but also it's bad for the UK, right?
Yeah.
It's absolutely objectively really bad for the UK on the international stage
Yeah. Yeah.
to be seen as one of, maybe three countries, USA, UK, and Germany, who have stood beside Israel this whole time is like a source of like real embarrassment to myself, like that, where in a country where our establishment did not see this coming. Like, look at this the stance. We have a lot of critiques of Macron as a leader. Look at the stance he took much earlier, much better, much more strong against the Israeli government. Look at the stance of Spain, for example.
Yeah. Yes.
Yet we
Exemplary.
continue to have, it's actually a source of like embarrassment to us, like not just in my heart that I live in a country where our
Yeah.
leaders allow this to happen,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
also internationally, it does not speak well of the UK, and where we are letting our reputation take a battering all in for the sake of a country who, number one, does not respect our government. Clearly doesn't, like, the government have been calling out illegal settlements for years. David Cameron has been calling called in the early 2010s. He called
Yeah.
a
Concentration
you
camp. Yeah.
know concentration camp or a prison or something
Open air
along
prison.
those
Yeah.
lines.
Yeah. Something like
Yeah,
that.
open air prison. That was it. He
Yeah.
called it
Yeah.
open air
Yeah.
prison,
Yeah.
not a concentration camp. Not to that.
Okay.
So they call it open air prison, right? The British government have been very clear on what they think is, yet they don't match that in terms of their policy,
Yeah.
and the Israeli government has continued to ignore us. So
Yeah.
why we're behaving like this, to me, it still remains kind of a mystery. So we know we will continue. I think we will continue to endorse candidates from
Yeah.
all parties. Like you said, I'm not really fussed about a party badge. What I am
Right.
fussed about is the
Right.
values that you are going to uphold whilst you're in
Right.
parliament.
Right. 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 Right.
And if you're going to uphold values of justice, of community, um, of making real change, of values which can challenge the far right, right, which can challenge
Right.
reform,
Right.
then I will happily get behind you
Right.
and endorse you and continue, because that's the only way, right? If the Muslim voice, the
Yeah.
Muslim voters,
Yeah.
if we can work with Muslim voters locally
Yeah.
as an organization
Yeah.
to make sure that their voice is used as a positive for the people of the UK, then we should continue to do that and try and mobilize and unite Muslims behind those decisions.
Right. Right. Um, so I'm going to actually switch gears slightly and ask maybe a bit more specific questions about the sort of the candidates who have run in the last election. It feels like an era away now. It's barely been 2 weeks. Well, I think it's been a week and a half, but it feels like it's another era. And so there are a number of instances. Let me ask maybe two questions. Um, One is that in several constituencies, pro-Palestinian independence narrowly lost because of a split vote. In some cases, this was between rival independents. So you had, unfortunately, maybe two or three independents, in some instances, all campaigning apparently for Palestine. Um, we even had that in Blackburn, but thankfully we didn't split the vote in that particular instance. Even though there was a split vote, the the Gaza pro-Gaza candidate came through. What can be learnt from this? Particularly like parties like Workers' Party, Green Party. I mean, I really felt bad about. I don't know if there was any endorsement at any point of Faiza Shaheen, for example, but Faiza Shaheen is she was endorsed. I mean, that's such a tragic case because, and again, like disgraceful behavior on the part of Labour HQ, but both she and the Greens got roughly equal votes and were in, I think spitting distance of, well, maybe not spitting distance, but if the Green candidate hadn't run,
I don't think so. Not in Chingford.
no, in Chingford,
Uh,
sorry, I
no,
forget
I
now.
don't think so.
Sorry,
I mean, unless you're talking about
She and the Labour candidate got around, I think, 14,000
yes,
each, and I
yeah,
think,
yeah, no, 13,500 each. Yeah, they beat, yeah, the Labour candidate, not the Green
yeah,
candidate.
sorry, not the Greens. My
Yeah.
apologies. You're across this obviously more than I am. So yeah, I wonder, like, what can be learnt from the split vote scenario in a first past the post system? What's the strategy? What do you think is the learning, so to speak?
I think, it's gone quite wrong quite quickly in France. However, I mean, there is a lesson to be learned from there in terms of they did form an alliance, a very broad alliance, all the way from social democrats to communists, right? That is I mean, I don't want to get into like political philosophy,
Yeah,
right? But that is a huge sway. That is like every
yeah,
part of the left you can think of
yeah,
is somewhere in that alliance.
yeah.
So they did, and they challenged the far right, and they won ultimately. Whether they managed to hold on to power, the eternal doom of the left is their inability to compromise on anything.
Mm,
Is going to be a challenge, but they compromise initially. Now, are they going to manage to go into government?
yeah, yeah,
Having worked with people from the left my whole life, I highly doubt it. I mean, unless the French left is very different, they're going to
mm,
just fight each other
right,
and continue to fight each other, and then
right.
disband after a period. But that's a total different issue.
Yeah,
I think. But what
yeah,
is a real lesson to be learned there is that they use the system to their
yeah,
advantage.
yeah.
They have they had a slight advantage because they had second rounds, and in a second round,
Mhm.
you can kind of see who's the most popular and
Yeah,
step
yeah,
aside.
yeah, yeah.
But I think we need to make those decisions much earlier. Like the
Mm,
Green Party should never have stood against Liane Mohammed. Like Liane Mohammed is perhaps she was perhaps the one of like the most important independents in the country. I would argue,
Mm.
her and Shocker were two of the most important. In terms of symbolically, she was going against West Streeton, the future leader of the Labour Party. She's a Palestinian, powerful voice,
How
very
common is that,
articulate,
though?
and the Green
If I
Party could
if I can
have
just
got behind
interject
her and
briefly.
given the votes. Yeah, go on.
So if I can interject briefly, I mean, how common is it that a party like the Greens, who have fielded as candidate, as far as I know, in every single constituency in the country, would say, "Oh, on one constituency, we're going to, abandon that principle of actually trying to develop a full blown party nationally," and that's what they're doing, and they're going to grow. There's no question about it going forward. Um, is that a realistic ask of the Greens? And in that sort of scenario, what is the answer? Is it for someone like Liane Mohammed to say, "Look, I'm going to join the Green Party and become like a voice within it," or is it something I'm not thinking of at all?
That's up to individual candidates. This is why these decisions have to be very localized. There is
Mhm.
not a national prescription to this. There is
Of
a
course,
localized prescription, which means you get all the candidates in a room who are on, broadly speaking, right? I think if we talk about anti-war, again, anti-war can mean a lot of things, but let's say the anti-war,
yeah,
anti-austerity, pro-NHS. I think, as far as I'm concerned, these are the three most important things for British politics at the moment, right? If you can get all the candidates in the room who are on that same wavelength, and say, okay, look, we've got to choose one. Who's the most popular locally?
yeah,
It was very clear Leanne was the most popular in Ilford.
right,
No one could deny that, right?
right,
All you have to do is walk down the street. She's like a celebrity there, almost like
right,
So it's really obvious that the Green Party should not have stood a candidate there.
right,
This is the
right,
first election, by the way, that they stood a candidate in every seat.
yeah, yeah,
Now, sure, we could say this was a learning moment. Maybe the Green Party underestimated her level of
yeah,
popularity.
yeah,
But going forward to 2029,
yeah,
there is a lesson to be learned, right? How do we articulate? How
yeah,
do we work to form these coalitions? Actually, it's on our website. We have an article written by
mm,
one of our member staff discussing this very issue,
yeah,
about lessons from the French election and how
yeah,
we can essentially, unite behind one candidate in
yeah,
every area. Now,
right,
will the
right,
Workers' Party and Green Party ever unite? Absolutely not. There's like
sure,
very little chance that that will ever
sure,
happen, because
sure.
there is like a significant, um,
Well,
like red line issues on them. So, for example, the
mhm,
Green Party are, remain pro NATO.
yeah,
Um, Not pro NATO as Labour are pro NATO, but in a different sense, as a security arrangement, they believe in it. That's a red line for the Workers' Party.
right, right,
The on the Green Party's end, obviously on social issues, they just
mhm,
can't get on board with uh, the Workers' Party, and that's a red line for them.
yeah,
So again, there is work to be done. Will the
yeah.
Workers' Party still be a force in 2029?
Who
I'm not
knows?
too sure.
No,
I don't
not.
think so. But will
Yeah,
this independent movement still be a force in
yeah,
2029, or will they form into a more serious electoral pact? I hope so, and I
yeah.
think so. So again,
But
it's very much important that they work together on a kind of broad coalition of issues, and on a case by case basis say, okay, this is best place for us to win. I'll give you like a very clear example where I think we should like just leave the area to the Greens is Bristol. So in
right,
Bristol, the Greens won or came second in almost every seat. If
yeah,
an
yeah,
independent ever came to me and said, I want to stand in Bristol, I would march them away
yeah.
from the seat, and I would tear up their papers and say, no, please don't.
Fair
No,
enough, fair enough.
go and canvass for the Green candidate, right? You have one responsibility: get the Green candidate, become their best friend, and canvass for them. That's
Right,
it.
right,
You
right,
don't have
right.
any other role. So, it is a case by case basis, and we should try and actually reflect what's happening in those areas.
So next question, I mean, kind of links into part of what you said there, because you were referring to the independents and how they should behave and going forward, etc. Because this election has very much been an exception in the history of British politics, where so many independents have emerged. It doesn't happen, and it suddenly makes it. It gives hope for those of us who have been frustrated with the establishment, but what next for the independents in a sense? Like, should they, especially the pro Gaza voices, the five of them, including Jeremy Corbyn, of course, do they? And Jeremy Corbyn, who knows how many years he's going to continue to serve, because he is, I think, in his mid-70s at this point, and he may, I think he's earned a retirement, to be honest. But he's
Very
done
much
so
so.
much to serve, and he's been a very powerful voice, obviously, for sort of Gaza in particular. And I wonder, is the British electoral establishment, in your analysis and assessment, one that is always going to be skewed against independent candidates? And does that mean the independents who are pro-Gaza somehow need to coalesce into some kind of group? But, Gaza is not a sufficient basis, surely, on which to coalesce. My understanding is Jeremy Corbyn's been doing the round saying party politics is broken. We need a new kind of politics. And he's creating local community hubs of some kind where there's going to be discussion. That sounds very promising. But again, community hubs do not a political party make. Does that, is there a need for a political party, or are political parties the enemy on some level to grassroots politics? Yeah. Big questions for you.
Very interesting question. Very, very big question. It'll be very interesting to see how these independents behave.
Yeah.
Again, this is my personal opinion. I'm a big fan of. So I sat down with Andrew Feinstein one day, Andrew Feinstein, who ran against Keir Starmer, and he was telling me, apologies. He was telling me all about the ANC and how they organized with Nelson Mandela once the apartheid regime had fallen and they had their first election. And he was telling me all about these meetings that they would hold, right, where they would just get the community in. And typically what happens is the politician stands at the front and then they talk to the electorate. And he was like, no, you sit there, and you be quiet. You don't say anything. And you just listen to the electorate. You listen to your constituents. You have someone who takes notes. And I really like that kind of model of politics. Actually, it was a truly like constituents-led model, and he did it. He replicated it in his area. We held one with him. Unfortunately, we had to do it over Zoom because every arena would initially accept our offer and then cancel last minute, and it became a bit of a pattern. So I have my conspiracies, but I can't. I'm not going to say why I think it is.
This happened,
it's
in London. This happened in London, but not nationally. Not nationally.
Yeah, no. Yeah, this happened in London. Yeah, just London. This one constituency, which happens to be Keir Starmer's constituency, kept cancelling our event. So again, like the what I'm trying to say is, whatever these independents do, I hope they become very community oriented, right? Not just on Gaza. I mean, on every issue, right? I want them to be the best local constituency MPs that this country could ever have. Right. And that's my hope for them. And that's the standard that I will, the Muslim vote. And I hope local Muslim constituents judge them by, because they can't become cults of personality, right? They can't become, oh, look, this is our guy now forever and never do anything. That's dangerous for everyone. What is good for everyone is that they become ultra local. They're visible everywhere. People need a hand. I know I can call on my MP, right? That's the kind of local MPs that we need, and I really want them to be holding these like local constituency meetings. I want them to have surgeries traveling around the constituency. I want them to organize meetings with youth clubs and the NHS and charities and schools and teachers, and sit down with the trade unions. That's what I want them to be. I don't want them to be Westminster heavy politicians. And that's the politics that I envision. How they operate will be very fascinating to see. But I think at the core of their politics, they have to be community oriented. After that, obviously they have to vote the correct way in Parliament. I think that's what they're predominantly sent there for. And then, if they can achieve that, should they build a party machinery? Maybe. I think that's really a decision for them to make as an independent group, and it'll be fascinating to see what they do on that front.
I think, and this is someone who's an academic, so to speak, sometimes stereotyped as the most irrelevant people in society. But in any case, I would suggest that there will be some major challenges in the way in which the establishment works. Is about realizing certain goals in the interest of the state as a whole, and really doesn't prioritize the interests of constituents. And in a democracy, ideally, we're trying to somehow tame that, the statist focus of the way in which the state is organized, the state has a logic of its own. It wants, it's obsessed with defense and security typically. And the people who make it to the top are usually only allowed to the top if that's, that's their perspective as well. And so all sorts of powerful forces are arrayed against genuine grassroots movements. This is the stage of democracy we're at right now. I mean, it's not a genuine democracy by any stretch of the imagination, I think. And I think democratic theorists, the better ones, will, accept that and recognize that. But and there's an interesting theological question for a Muslim as well. Like, to what extent, can we create an Islamic democratic mindset as well? And how does that vary in various contexts? I'm becoming a bit too academic in that, perhaps.
So
But I think,
I'll go with the first part,
yeah.
where you talked about, again, this is why I say that in terms of British democracy, in terms of first past the post,
Mm,
we actually do not have it the worst. We are not
mm,
America, right?
mhm.
You genuinely, because I think people, they create this myth of the state, and I think that's how the state sometimes, protects itself,
Mm,
right? You create this like all powerful image and myth of the state, and then you say like change can't be made. I
right,
promise you, like
right, right,
genuinely from the bottom of my heart, I truly believe this,
right,
that
right.
if people understood how restricted the established parties were
Mm,
in spending and capabilities during the election period,
mm.
you could you could get genuinely 650 seats. No joke. I
Right,
genuinely
right,
mean this from the bottom of my heart, right? If you
definitely.
organize locally,
Yeah, yeah.
650 seats, you could defeat established parties because the
Mm,
rules are that strict. They're only allowed to spend in a
mm,
6 week period. The spending
mm.
limit is under £20,000.
Wow.
You're not telling me there are like three businessmen in the community who could find a
Yeah,
local grassroots
yeah, yeah,
community worker, give them 7 grand each.
yeah,
You
yeah,
know, he can spend it and run a campaign. Like, it might be difficult,
yeah.
but it's possible. It genuinely is very possible.
What
Like
about
some of
spending
these
on
candidates,
Facebook advertising and things like that? Is that
no,
also
no, the
restricted?
total spending is set under £20,000. Like,
Okay.
you can defeat established parties. Now there are big issues in terms of like, people look at the prime minister before they look at the MP's name. They look at
Yeah,
the party
yeah,
badge.
yeah.
But the Gaza independents, but not the Gaza independents, the wrong way of saying it, the local independent candidates have proven that if you can mobilize people, you can beat the established parties, and this
Mm,
can be replicated absolutely
right.
everywhere. I have no doubts about it. You just have to
Fascinating.
prove to people it's possible. There's a reason
Fascinating.
turnout was 60%, right? If you got those other 40% to turn out
I think it
and
was
vote
lower.
for a
I got the impression that, yeah,
59.7,
something.
I think was
I
the
mean, yeah,
number.
something. Yeah, but sorry. Yeah, being finicky though.
I mean, it's like a very like precise, like, yeah, let's say
Yeah,
around 60%.
yeah, yeah,
People can defeat established parties. Now,
yeah.
can you challenge the establishment in the same way one's doing that? Who
Mm,
knows? I mean, that's a question to be answered and to be seen.
right,
But the
right.
first step really like lies in people understanding
Yeah.
that we are not in America. They cannot blow you out of the water financially. It is impossible.
Mm-hmm,
It's against the
mm-hmm,
rules. And
mm-hmm.
the Electoral Commission, for all anyone may want to critique democracy and say they've done X, Y, and Z, are quite firm on the rules.
So,
And there would never be like a country where West Streeting comes within 700 votes of losing. So you can beat them. There
but
is
at
a
the
real
same,
hope there.
yeah, at the same time, you have this, the broader establishment can, in the case of someone like Jeremy Corbyn, for example, just go guns blazing, attack them
Mm.
like relentlessly, and sow serious doubt in lots of people's hearts. So, Jeremy Corbyn, everyone who knows him personally and knows his sort of policies thinks he's a thoroughly ethical, decent man, right? I mean, he's like, how can you destroy someone who is that good and that decent in a sense? But in a sense, like the entire establishment was against him, and my suspicion, and the polling, made this quite clear, that a lot of people were genuinely afraid, fearful of having him as prime minister, and that's what happened in 2019. Was the success of that campaign against you. So I do think that it's true, the rules in terms of election donations and the like, and spending in particular, are limited, as you've put, but of course there are various ways of trying to
Yeah,
tip the
I
balance.
mean, on that front, what
Yeah,
we're seeing, and this is why I'm not saying this will be done in 5 years or 10 years.
yeah,
but give
Yeah.
it 30, 40 years, we genuinely could see a very localized democracy.
Mm.
And the reason for that is the power of established media is collapsing very quickly. Less and less people watch.
Mm,
Now,
mm,
I
mm.
would argue they have very strong agenda setting power again, like without
Yeah.
getting too much into
Yeah.
academics. I remember I wrote one of my long
Yeah.
essays on this at university, arguing that Twitter does not have the power that it loves to claim. And agenda setting power is still firmly with
Of course.
mainstream media,
Of course.
despite its lack of use. But
Although
that's
this
a
is
whole
perhaps
separate
the first
discussion.
time, this is the first general
Yeah,
election where the newspapers endorsing a candidate didn't really matter.
it didn't. Like,
Yeah.
the Sun came out and endorsed Labour last minute, not because they thought the Labour Party were amazing, but because they knew Labour was going to win. And
Yeah. Yeah.
Rupert Murdoch's a clever man. Maybe not an ethical man, but he's a very clever man.
Yeah. Yeah.
So again, like we've got to understand the landscape that we're operating in. And
Yeah.
sometimes people think I sound like a weird lefty or like a when I say this, but genuinely only starts with hope. Like in Islam, we talk about this last having this yaqeen in Allah that change is possible. I promise you, the electoral system will only change, and
Yeah.
democracy will only become more effective of your values if you believe that it can.
Yeah.
And as
Yeah.
far as you believe it can change, it will change. And will we get a utopia from a democratic system? Probably not. But can we see the change that the Labour Party caused in the 1920s and the early 1940s, where the welfare state expanded and NHS was established, and it became a lot more equal society?
Yeah.
Absolutely. I have no doubts in my heart that that is an achievable
Inshallah.
gain
Inshallah.
in the next 40, 50 years, and a localized democracy. And I really emphasize this: a localized democracy where MPs are truly accountable to their local constituents. It's very achievable. People just have to, you know, educate, continue to organize locally, and empower strong community leaders to become those voices.
So I mean, the point that you made just now about hope, and it's fascinating that you describe it as sort of people accusing you of being lefty, because hope is one of the key characteristics of the Prophet ﷺ. كان صلى الله عليه وسلم يعجبه الفأل الخير, as it comes in certain hadiths, that he used to like optimism. He used to like seeing positive omens and the like. But at the same time, yes, there is a wonderful left-leaning thinker or thinker on the left from the last century, Antonio Gramsci, who had a wonderful phrase. He says, you have to have pessimism of the intellect, but optimism of the will. You have to recognize that the world is a very dark place, but your will has to be driven by your optimism. But we have that 1400 years ago, as it were. And
I do love Gramsci, my favorite
yeah,
Marxist.
right. And someone who died in prison, right? I mean, but the optimism and the positivity is absolutely essential. Yeah, I'd love to have a conversation, perhaps in future, and perhaps with a group of people about sort of Islam and its relationship with the left, because we are a very tiny minority. We're not going to work successfully in this country unless we have partnerships with people where we can disagree somewhat. We can, but as long as there are certain types of groups where it would be a struggle to work together. Reform, who basically have set themselves up in a way to say that actually it's all these immigrants who are the problem and we're the descendants of immigrants. But again, never say never. I would have the hope that we can even convert sort of people from reform to see that actually we're here to help improve the country and make it better for all people involved. But I guess there's a lot to be said for hope, and in a sense, a lack of hope is a dereliction of duty on the part of the Muslim electorate, and we need to, But at the same time, there are people who are struggling at food banks. They're going to food banks every week. They're struggling to raise their families. Muslims also, historically at least, have had relatively large families, and so we temper our obligation to hope with the recognition that people are genuinely struggling and we should do whatever we can to help them. But that should spur us on furthermore.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, there's
Yeah,
a
no, absolutely. Yeah.
Go ahead.
I
Sorry.
think the key is when you're in my position, or the position of people who are privileged, actually to persons like yourself, to think about these issues and ponder on them, and try and think of solutions. I think we have a level of duty to be a bit delusional,
Absolutely.
if I'm honest. I think there is no, like, the thing is, like, a lot of the time I listen to people who are like scholars, or like, academic or Islamic scholars, or people who are in these privileged positions like myself, or community
Yeah.
organizers and stuff,
Yeah. Yeah.
and they talk with such pessimism,
Mm,
and
mm,
all they do is critique the system, critique the system, critique the
mm,
system. And look,
mm,
I could do that.
mm.
We
Yeah.
could do this whole podcast again. I would provide you
Yeah.
an entire critique of British democracy.
Sure. Sure.
Fine, right? What is the purpose of that? Like, you're talking to the everyday person.
Yeah. Yeah.
The everyday person will only go out and take an action if you make them truly believe, and I still believe this within my heart, that there is change to be made within that
Yeah. Yeah.
system. And if you can embrace that, then you can start getting people on board. If we just go around critique after critique after, no, there is
Right.
obviously there's place for critique, especially
Yeah.
within the halls of power.
Yeah.
And there's also a place for honest critique when we talk to people, that there are limitations to what we can do within the parliamentary democratic system.
Sure.
I have no doubts. But
Sure.
if we only talk about the limitations, then why would people turn up to vote? Why will
Yeah.
people
Yeah.
turn up and try and make a difference? Why will someone go out and canvass?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And I think, I genuinely see it as like a semi obligation upon myself to create this, help be a small part of creating this more optimistic narrative
Right.
around the possibility of change.
Right. Right.
um, and
Absolutely.
that it is possible, because otherwise, like, you just get stuck into this cycle. I remember, I used to talk about prevent a lot, and when I talk about prevent, I always tell people the primary obligation of prevent is not actually to get you reported or to
Mm,
de-radicalize you. The
mm,
primary purpose of prevent is to stop you from talking in the first place,
mm,
because
mm.
it creates a system of fear. The same way, the primary reason that people, the primary issue with disillusionment is not your disillusionment. It's the fact that it gives power to the establishment to carry on behaving the way they are. And
Yeah.
if we can stop you being disillusioned, and if we can help you, show you that there's a real alternative,
Yeah.
then hopefully, by doing this to enough people, by having these 1,000, 5,000, 10,000, 100,000 conversations,
Yeah.
you can
Yeah.
create a real change within the democratic process.
Inshallah, inshallah. I mean, really, very positive note. I mean, we'll come back to hope perhaps, and I'm just a bit conscious of your time. I had one or two other questions, if that's okay.
Of course.
So with respect to, and we've covered elements of this as well, but I wanted to um, think maybe a bit more explicitly about the Muslims and potential partners and sticking points. So do you think it's plausible that there could be an electoral alliance between anti-Labour independents, or, I mean, we'll have to anti-establishment independents? I'll rephrase that because uh, we need to think long into the future, and the Labour government is here now for the next 5 years, but who knows going into the future? So, anti-establishment independents and smaller parties like the Greens, can we create electoral alliances? So, for Muslims, a small minority in British politics at the moment, to be politically significant, alliances and political groups with other political groups is going to be necessary. But these groups on the left might hold certain social views or views on social issues that we might find that we strongly disagree with in some instances. We can be, fairly explicit about this. Perhaps on LGBTQ issues, there might be very different perspectives. Muslims tend to be socially conservative because of their religious outlook. And how do we negotiate that reality, in your view? And
Yeah,
again,
so yeah, I'm
we can
presuming
speak in
your
a
audience
personal.
is predominantly Muslim, right?
Sorry.
Is your audience predominantly Muslim?
Yes, I mean, I work. My
Okay.
YouTube channel is called Islamic Perspectives, as you can see on the bottom
So
right.
yeah, I want to look. I want to discuss this issue from a Muslim lens, not an Islamic lens, right? This is not
Okay,
an
sure, sure,
Islamic
sure,
position. This is
sure,
a
absolutely.
Muslim. This is
Yeah,
a position that I've thought about a lot
yeah.
as a Muslim who
And
in
I don't want to
politics, who has
obligate
spent a lot
you.
of time
Yeah,
working in the left, right? And I think um, the reality is that we live in a pluralistic society. I
yeah,
mean, me and you had this discussion before,
yeah,
and I think we the reality is that people from with very different perspectives deserve to have their rights protected, absolutely
yeah,
100%. And I would
yeah,
argue against anyone who
yeah.
suggests otherwise.
Sure, sure, sure.
Right? They absolutely deserve to have their rights protected. So on that front, I think I have a softer stance than many Muslims maybe on this issue, and I think it remains true that I think we shouldn't try to push back
yeah,
on on the protections of their rights. In fact, I think we should defend their rights to live in freedom and dignity.
yeah,
Now, again, when we're working with the left, obviously there are issues whether about LGBT education in schools and
yeah,
about medical issues. That there will be legitimate disagreements that I also would share concerns with,
yeah,
like many Muslims would do. I think
right,
on these issues, right, there is understanding to be built. I think on majority of issues, again, like if you agree with someone on 80%,
yeah,
the 20% there can be either agreement,
yeah,
a there can either be you can come to an agreement which basically be a compromise, or you
yeah,
can agree silence,
yeah,
right? On these issues. I think these discussions need to be taking place with people much more senior than myself, much more
sure, sure,
ingrained
sure,
in
sure.
those parties,
Yeah,
structures. But I think that, is the left as big as it sometimes claims to be? Probably not.
mm,
But is there an expanding base of Green Party voters across the country? Absolutely. And I think
mm,
most people are mature enough to understand. Actually, most Muslims are mature enough to understand that alliances do have to be built, and they won't be perfect alliances. There's
yeah,
going to be no perfect alliance with no one, right? For
yeah,
example, Jeremy Corbyn is beloved by the Muslim community. No
absolutely.
one likes his position. No, Muslims do not like his position on Bosnia, right? Like,
Right.
or Syria, for example.
Yeah, yeah,
Like, there is not a perfect politician out there.
right, right,
Um,
right.
so compromises will have to be made as long as individual MPs who are Muslim now, who actually are Muslim, do not compromise on them,
Yeah, yeah,
right? So let's say, for example, in Preston, we endorsed a candidate called Michael Lavler.
right,
Michael Lavler, he's a great guy, has amazing politics, and not only has amazing politics, has proven his politics in action, right, over the
yeah,
last
yeah,
15, 20 years.
yeah,
Very close to the left. The ulama in Preston almost, that we talked to all said, like,
yeah,
this is the guy. This is the guy from the community who we want to back, right? He
right,
got 8,000, 9,000 votes in
right,
Preston,
right,
uh,
right,
from a very large Muslim and non-Muslim base.
right.
Um, and he, my presumption is that, because a
Yeah,
lot of people send us an email going, "How dare you endorse someone who's pro-LGBT?" I said, like, really, is that the discussion you want to be having right now?
hmm.
Um, but it's like a very
So,
difficult conversation we're going to have, but it
yeah,
will require, I think, that the thing is, we're going to have to come to a baseline agreement
yeah,
that, everyone's rights deserve to be protected. I think we should all agree on that. And then secondly, I think we should, come to an agreement, okay, of where do we share values and where can we push
yeah,
on
yeah,
those values, and how can we work together? And
right,
that's where we should do. So whether
yeah,
that be, like I said, I think there's three broad things that we can all agree on.
yeah,
Muslims and on the left, right? I've already
yeah,
said it before once. I'll say it
yeah,
again. We're all basically pro anti-war, right? In some, wherever you want that word to mean, we're in some shape of anti-war.
right.
We're also,
For NHS and
we're pro
anti.
NHS and we're anti-austerity. And I think if we can agree on those three broad principles, on other issues we can,
Agree to disagree.
have an agreement. Yeah, agree to disagree, and that's absolutely fine. We
Yeah,
don't need a pure agreement, because if you want that, then unfortunately, politics is not the place
right.
for you.
Politics is the art of the possible, right? It's the
Yeah.
realm of compromise. I think apologies if I put you on the spot with that question. But I think as you answered it in a very sensible way. I might articulate. I mean, I'm a theologian. I can sort of think about these things a lot more freely than someone who's kind of in grassroots politics in a sense and have to maintain various kinds of alliances. If you allow me to put it that way, but what I would say is that so this is something I've held for a long time. We live in a non-Muslim society, and in an from an Islamic perspective, actually, the worst sin is disbelief, right? So we are taught that we are supposed to tolerate people who have sort of that sort of, from a religious perspective, fundamental sin that they're engaged in, and I don't think theologically speaking, or indeed politically speaking, that anyone should object to our right to hold that position, that we consider, not believing in God or not believing in the Prophet Muhammad to be sinful from an Islamic perspective. Yet no one's going to target us and basically vilify us for being Muslim, even though that's what being Muslim entails necessarily, right? And just for the record, like if a Muslim doesn't believe that a non-Muslim engaged, in that is not, in conformity with, or how can I put this? If a Muslim doesn't believe that being a non-Muslim is not sinful, that actually undermines their own belief. So this is something which we believe quite fundamentally, but we're not saying that that person is somehow like a bad person in any conventional social sense. This is a theological assessment that someone who is not a believer is considered to be sinful before God, right? But God commands us to treat them with justice and treat them with respect and treat them with dignity in the Quran itself, incidentally. And there's a famous verse, I think, forget exactly the number of the surah, but in Surah Mumtahana, where it says, لا ينهاكم الله, sorry about the sound of the sirens. لا ينهاكم الله عن الذين لم يقاتلوكم في الدين ولم يخرجوكم من دياركم أن تبروهم وتقسطوا إليهم إن الله يحب المقسطين. That God does not prohibit you from treating with the utmost respect and dignity people who haven't driven you out of your homes and haven't treated you unjustly. And we live in these societies where, we are overwhelmingly treated with dignity, respect, and justice by the system. And so so if that's the case with someone who's a non-Muslim, sorry, this is a very long-winded academic answer at this point, then someone who identifies as LGBTQ or upholds those sorts of beliefs, that's not considered to be as something which is like actual disbelief in God and the Messenger of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so I think from an internal Muslim perspective, we don't hold that as our belief, and we actually strongly disagree that those sorts of things should be advocated socially. But what I want to argue for in the British public sphere is we should have every right to hold the position that I've just articulated. We conscientiously disagree. We conscientiously object to being forced to accept something which goes against our own religious doctrine, which says that being LGBTQ is something which should be actively advocated by everyone in the public sphere. And this is quite different from other forms of a minority status in the perspective of a Muslim. So there is an Islamic conception of what constitutes minority status. Racial discrimination is completely unacceptable from an Islamic perspective. The Prophet himself said, no person, no black person or white person is superior to anyone else except through God consciousness. So that's something which is embedded in our traditions. But LGBTQ issues, I would argue, with all respect for my fellow compatriots in the UK or in Amsterdam, where I happen to live, who identify in that way, just as you identify as non-Muslim, and I respect your right to identify as that, I also respect your right to identify as LGBTQ in this sort of context. We have that as a constitutional settlement in these sorts of environments, and I'm not going to impose myself. I hope that makes sense. Sorry, that was very long-winded, but I thought I would just articulate that. This doesn't reflect the Muslim vote or Brother Abubakr necessarily.
Even my position doesn't necessarily reflect the entire Muslim votes, because if as a new organization, it's a broad coalition. I think this is my reflection as someone who's been in this space for a long time.
Yeah.
It's just we need to have a level of maturity more than anything else when we have these discussions. And we need to discuss with people of knowledge, of course. But like this very reactionary kind of, oh no, you can never build an alliance with anyone, I think is quite patently just it doesn't understand the political system or the place that we live in. And on broad swathes of issues and the most important issues, they agree with us.
Yeah.
Right, on the most important issues, they are on our side. And really, when it comes to a matter of life or death for your brothers and sisters in Gaza, in whether it was Afghanistan, whether it was Iraq, they come out and stood by your side, the left, right? And for that, when the most important issue, when it comes to the murder of your, your fellow Muslim brothers and sisters abroad, they come out and stood by your side. So there is that value to working with them and continue to working with them.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think, and again, I hope you don't mind I went down this kind of direction, but I also think that there needs to be a bit more of a mature conversation in the Muslim public sphere on these sorts of questions about what the possibilities are, what's necessary, what's not. And yeah, I think you just mentioned you have to consult the people of knowledge as well, but in the political sphere, there are also people of knowledge who understand the context of politics and understand what are the right sorts of decisions. That's a type of ijtihad as well. You can consult, if you're a person in that sphere, with someone who is theologically sort of an expert as well, just to have a better understanding of, okay, where are the red lines? I can say that, just as an example, I would say people who are LGBTQ in these societies, we respect their right to be that, but I'm not going to go to a pride parade, right? And I actually think that that's not just a red line. That's actually very, very serious sin on the part of a Muslim who does that sort of thing. And so yeah, I mean, that's something I would argue as a theologian, and a political figure might come to me and have a conversation with me and say that, look, I'm making certain judgments about these sorts of things, and I actually dissent from you on that. And at the end of the day, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to be our final sort of judge. But there are people I know of in sort of politics who, have consulted religious experts and have disagreed with them on these sorts of issues, and pursued lines which theologically seem very suspect. And I think it's important for Muslims to give a certain amount of space and not become reactionary. And certainly one of the things that I would warn every lay Muslim against is engaging in anything like takfir, for example. But
absolutely not against anyone,
yeah,
basically ever. That is
the,
absolutely, especially in political spaces. I mean, and the one thing that I've learned in the last 6 months, and I think maybe this might be a closing reflection of mine,
yeah,
is having done this and talked to a lot of people and told people, look, the Muslim vote is not a religious campaign, not because I don't care about my faith, but because there
yeah,
is so much room for disagreement with
yeah,
Islam, like
yeah,
legitimate room for disagreement. I
absolutely,
am not going to tell you that this is a a
absolutely,
religious thing, and people think that this is just because that the electoral commission law says you can't use spiritual influence. I genuinely think that we shouldn't say it's called the Muslim vote, it's not called the Islamic vote, is it? Right,
yeah,
we are making recommendations based on a set of principles that is
yeah,
on our website, but also there is plenty of room for legitimate disagreement
yeah,
um, within that.
yeah,
But the problem comes is when you disagree with people and they start using all this kind of spiritual language.
mm-hmm.
On a personal level, I tell people when they start working with me, look, make decisions that you can stand in front of Allah on the day
Yeah,
of judgment and
yeah,
be prepared to answer for. But
yeah,
when people disagree with you, I think it's quite frankly irresponsible to go around and say to them, you have to answer to Allah for this. Because what you're trying to essentially do is
yeah,
spiritually
yeah.
manipulate them into making
Well,
certain decisions.
yeah,
And I think we have to be very uh, we have to quite reflect on how we engage with the political sphere
yeah,
on a religious level, and also like make understand that difference of opinion in Islam is not like a kind of like some liberal um you know fantasy land lie. It is genuinely there's a reason there are four schools of fiqh. Now, obviously there are red lines. I'm not saying don't open up these red lines,
right,
but where
right,
there are legitimate difference of opinion,
yeah,
we have to be willing to have these conversations quite in a mature and sensible manner without you know you slandering people,
yeah,
like calling people like Nashar a genocide supporter on the streets of Bradford is, frankly speaking,
yeah.
just not
Yeah.
acceptable,
Well,
because
it's also
she
factually
never
untrue.
was. Yeah,
It's
and she
factually
never
untrue,
has
but
been, and she has been consistent vote
yeah,
for Muslims in Parliament for years.
yeah,
And right, you can disagree with her staying in the Labour Party, you
yeah,
know, you
sure,
absolutely can. There isn't. You can say,
right,
why are you standing in this genocide enabling party? Now,
right.
obviously, legally speaking, I'm not saying Labour is a genociding enabled party, but people could ask that question. That
I
is some
think
of the language that was used, right?
there's a case
You
to be
can
made.
ask that question.
Yeah,
Yeah. You can ask that question. That's a legitimate. You can ask that question. That's a legitimate question to ask. But say she's a genocide supporter
Yeah,
is vastly out of line. Like this,
yeah,
like unacceptable behavior. I'm
yeah,
sorry.
yeah,
Like you saying that she supports the genocide of fellow
yeah,
Muslims is absolutely outrageous, and you have
yeah.
to sit back and reflect on that behavior. And I think it's
Right.
really important that we, are quite frank and honest when we have those conversations. That there are red lines that we can't cross, especially when it comes to dealing with
Absolutely.
our
Yeah.
fellow Muslims in this space, but also with our fellow allies, and having sensible, reasonable discussions instead of throwing around really broad, um, you know, accusations against them.
Right, right. I mean, so just to conclude on a more positive note, because I think, there's some sort of difficult issues that we will have to have long-term conversations on. And I'd love to actually continue this conversation, separate to this broadcast, inshallah. Perhaps you can actually stick around a little bit longer after we conclude. But to sort of like focus on a positive note, the Muslim vote has been spectacularly successful, considering it didn't exist like 7 months ago. And it's actually, one of the things that has spurred it into existence, of course, has been the Gaza genocide, but it's a lot bigger than that, of course, and it's going to be something which, in some respects, our martyred brothers and sisters in Gaza, they deserve credit for getting us off our backsides and getting us to be active. But at the same time, what does the future hold? Like, what do the next 5 years, 10 years, and even 20 years look like in your view? Give us some
This
hopeful
was
predictions.
yeah, this was a conversation I had very early with Ustad Anas Al Takriti on his podcast, actually,
Yeah.
London Circle.
Right, right,
And I'm a very big believer. Actually, no, this is not even believer. I know this for a fact that
right.
genocides are never stopped when they start. Right, like genocides are stopped before they ever happen. I think it's like quite a hard thing to conceptualize.
Mm-hmm.
But there's this like when if you ever do political training with lefties, they always talk about organization versus mobilization,
Yeah.
right? There is no community better at mobilizing than the Muslim community.
Mm.
When a tragedy happens, snap of a finger, we will raise. So, for example, I always give this example that's a little less like emotionally, draining. Let's talk about floods in Pakistan and Bangladesh, which have been happening a lot recently, right?
Mm.
A flood happens, the Muslim community in the UK easily will raise £5 million within a week
Right,
for the victims, right? But
right, yeah,
I'm being conservative in that estimate, to be honest.
right,
Like sometimes
right.
one family will give £5 million.
Subhanallah.
Alhamdulillah, may Allah continue to bless those families, right?
I mean,
But we will easily raise those money. But we ever sat there and thought, well, why is the flood happening every year in the first
right,
place, right?
right,
And then every year we come to the masjid again, and there's there's Ramadan, and we have these like trays and trays of like plastic everywhere,
right.
and you're raising money for Pakistan floods in the same masjid, and no one seems to like want to put the dots together and say
Mm.
like,
Yeah,
what are we doing, right?
yeah. We're
And I
contributing to
think,
the climate crisis,
mhm,
which is creating it.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
you are creating the flood that you're paying
Right.
to damage, like repair, like may Allah accept your £5, but also
Yeah.
um like what are we doing, like genuinely, like what are we doing?
Mm.
And I think that is a reflection for us all that we have to, if we want to become a serious um force for good in the UK, we
Mhm.
have to always be organized. We
Mm.
cannot afford to only mobilize at the time of a genocide. And the real test will be in 4 years' time.
Right,
Will these independents have been good enough, and will they have organized in their communities well enough to win the next general election?
right, right,
Will they have created a system where those who came close, people like Leanne, people like Jody, um, like in Bethnal Green, will they have the people there available to win these now what have become very marginal seats,
yeah, yeah.
right? Will we have been able to have enough impact on Labour
Mm.
Party policy that
Mm.
the Attorney General who they selected, very positive choice by the way, exceptionally
Yes,
positive. I
yes,
don't
yes,
think
yes.
he would have been selected if it wasn't from pressure from
Well,
pro-Palestinian
I
activists
hope,
and Muslims and such.
yeah, I hope
You
he
know,
does something.
empowered. Yeah,
Yeah,
I
I
hope
hope.
he's empowered, because if he's empowered, he will do the right things. Right? Will he be empowered to make those right decisions? Like, will he be able to ban arms sales like he indicated he thinks was the right thing to do back in November? Right? Like, these are very these are metrics for us to decide as whether,
Yeah,
okay, do we
yeah,
think we've
yeah.
had the relevant difference or not, and can we continue to be organized? And I think there is obviously a very, place of privilege that me and you here again are talking from, because we are
Right,
not, alhamdulillah, look, I do come from a working class community and background, but alhamdulillah, I work in the political sphere. So I
right,
have all day to organize and organize and organize. But,
right.
and a lot of Muslims are unfortunately,
Yeah,
very economically deprived
yeah,
and working class. But are we able to bring them into the tent and say, look, guys, like, this deprivation comes from a place, this
yeah.
economic inequality comes from a place. Do you want to work together and see if we can tackle this? And
Right.
can we bring them on that journey with us, rather
Yeah,
rather
yeah.
than just telling them, just work hard, go and get an education, go to university,
Right.
and get out and come and get a good job. Like, that's the attitude that we've had for a long time, which khair,
Yeah,
alhamdulillah, has done a lot of good for our community.
yeah,
But
yeah,
now can we come and have a more structural analysis and
yeah,
understanding of
yeah,
where we are, and how we can be a voice of justice, not just for to become Muslims within the middle class, which is ever
yeah,
shrinking. I mean, we could have that conversation the other day as well. But
yeah.
but how do we become Muslims who empower the working class to live lives of
Dignity.
dignity,
Yeah,
really?
yeah,
And that's what we have to try to continue to organize to do. And I think these areas where MPs have won, it'll be very interesting to see how they mobilize the community, organize the community, and how they create alliances with their non-Muslim counterparts, and how they bring them into the tent, and how they represent the whole constituency. Remember,
inshallah.
like these areas, I don't think any of the areas that won were over 50% Muslim.
Right,
Blackburn
right,
comes the closest, and I think
right, right,
it's in the mid 40s.
right.
So the majority of all these people, all these MPs' constituents are non-Muslims, right? You
Absolutely,
have to represent them. How do
absolutely.
we work with them? How do we organize with them? Well, not we. How do they organize with them, and bring and ensure that we do become a religious community, a ethnic community, a a
Of
minority
service.
community who can build service. Yeah, we have to think about, this is your Islamic
Yeah,
responsibility. This is the only Islamic point I will make.
right,
You have a
right.
responsibility of to be service to your community.
Absolutely,
That, I
absolutely.
mean, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but that is a theological thing. I think we can all agree on that. You have to be of
Yeah, yeah.
service, and we have to figure out how we can be of service, and not just
There's a,
so that Muslims
yes,
get good PR, as sometimes we kind of do, but because that is your duty as a human and as a Muslim, within the UK, to make sure that everyone around you, like your neighbor, is not starving, right? That there is not a
absolutely,
homeless person on
absolutely,
the street.
absolutely,
Like, that
absolutely.
is your ethical duty, right?
Yeah,
That your neighbor is not forced to go to a food bank for the next 20 years, but in fact is able to go and buy food from the shop himself with a bit of
right,
dignity, and
right, right,
hope in their heart, and have a bit of a few options, right? Or
right.
your young child is able to afford a house in 30 years without being plundered into a 8% interest rate mortgage, which will end up costing them like 4 times the house rent value of the house. Like, these are genuinely
Mm.
conversations
Yeah,
and
yeah,
things that we need to see
yeah,
how we as Muslims can be a force for the common good.
yeah,
And
yeah.
that's inshallah the future of the Muslim vote.
Barakallahu feekum. I think that's a very hopeful note, actually, on which to conclude. Like, there is so much good to be done, and this is one of the things. Even in moments of darkness, the Muslim sees that actually the darkness that might be surrounding them in terms of austerity, in terms of crumbling NHS and crumbling services, is a signal that we need to get our act together and start doing good in society and trying to bring society out of that dark place. And this is something which, again, from a religious perspective, Muslims can bring and empower our society as a whole, and bring that sort of like vibrancy to it. We're a young community as well. Our average age, according to the last census, is around 27, and so which is much lower than the national average of about 44, I think. And so there are so many ways in which we can live up to the Prophet's hadith. What you just mentioned is actually a hadith. خير الناس أنفعكم للناس, or خير الناس أنفعهم للناس. The best of people are those who are the most beneficial to people, the people who are serving others. And so, inshallah, I hope we can live up to those sorts of standards. I really, again, commend you, Abu Bakr, for dedicating your life to this. And I think more and more people need to be involved in these sorts of activities, in bridging those sorts of spaces between the political establishment and the grassroots, and doing what we can to build that understanding and give the grassroots a voice, inshallah, give communities a voice. Jazakumullah khairan again. Really honored to have that opportunity to speak to you. Please do stick around a bit longer, inshallah. I'll have a chat with you just after we conclude. But with that, I really appreciate also all the people who were kindly sticking around and viewing. I didn't realize we actually had one question, but I'm going to pass on this, if you'll forgive us, because we are at time and I need to go and pick up my children in a moment from school. But it's been wonderful having so many people also attending, and look forward to seeing you on the next one, inshallah. Subhanakallahumma bihamdik, nashhadu an la ilaha illa ant, nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.